My son Thaddeus locked me in the basement, confiscated my phone, and when I begged him to call an ambulance as my diabetes was spiraling out of control, he simply turned his back and walked away, believing my death would finally give him access to my 400 life insurance policy. I am a 72-year-old retired mechanic, and he is my only child who sees me as nothing more than a financial burden. But when he returned to check on me 18 hours later, what he discovered made him drop to his knees in horror. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what your biggest fear about family is. The familiar creak of my workshop door should have brought me comfort after 3 weeks in the rehabilitation center. Instead, it sounded like a warning bell echoing through the converted garage that had become my bedroom since the stroke. My name is Cornelius Blackwood, and at 72, I'd thought I'd seen the worst life could throw at me. I was wrong. Dad, you're finally back. Thaddeus didn't look up from his laptop, sprawled across my favorite leather recliner like he owned it. His wife Morgana emerged from my kitchenette, dish towel in hand, her smile thin as paper. Cornelius, you look tired. I set down my medical bag and discharged papers, scanning the space that had been my sanctuary for 5 years. My vintage car magazines were gone. The framed photos of my late wife Vivienne had vanished from the workbench. Even my collection of antique wrenches, tools I'd inherited from my father, had disappeared. Where are my things? I asked, my voice hoarse from weeks of medical procedures. We've been organizing, Morgana said in that practiced tone she used when deflecting uncomfortable questions. Everything was getting so cluttered down here. Cluttered? These weren't random objects. They were my life, my memories, my connection to the man I used to be before the stroke stole my independence. I'd worked 45 years as a master mechanic, built engines with these hands, fixed things that others declared impossible. Now I could barely manage the stairs to the main house. Thaddeus finally looked up from his screen. Dad, we need to discuss your living situation moving forward. Moving forward. As if I wasn't part of the equation anymore. As if the rehabilitation had been my funeral instead of my recovery. I shuffled toward the corner where I kept my personal belongings, my left leg still weak from the stroke. Everything was packed in banker's boxes, labeled in Morgana's neat handwriting. Cornelius, storage, storage, like I was already dead. Why are my possessions in boxes? Thaddeus appeared beside me, blocking my path back to the living area. We thought you might prefer a more manageable arrangement. You're not getting any younger, and this basement isn't suitable for someone in your condition. Your condition. He said it like I was contaminated, dangerous to be around. The rehabilitation center had cleared me for independent living. I could walk, albeit slowly. I could manage my diabetes with proper medication. I could still think clearly, despite what my son apparently believed. The doctors said I was ready to come home. The doctors don't live here, Thaddeus replied, crossing his arms. Morgana and I do. We're the ones who have to deal with the reality of your situation. The evening shadows stretched across my workshop floor, and suddenly this place I'd built with my own hands felt like a tomb. My son stood there, looking at me with eyes that held no warmth, no recognition of the man who'd taught him to change oil, to swing a hammer, to be decent to people who couldn't defend themselves. I climbed the narrow stairs to the main house, each step a small victory over the lingering weakness in my left leg. Behind me, I heard whispered conversation between Thaddeus and Morgana, their voices too low to catch but urgent enough to set my nerves on edge. They were planning something, and whatever it was didn't include consulting the man whose house they were living in. The kitchen looked different, cleaner somehow, but also emptier. Vivienne's recipe box, the one she'd decorated with pressed flowers from our garden, was missing from its place beside the stove. Her ceramic rooster collection had vanished from the windowsill. Even the calendar with her handwriting marking important dates had been replaced with a stark digital display. Where's Vivienne's recipe box? I asked when Morgana appeared. Oh, that old thing? We donated it to charity. The recipes were so outdated, and we thought someone else might get better use from it. Outdated? My wife's legacy. Reduced to clutter for the donation bin. Those recipes weren't just instructions for cooking. They were love letters written in flour and sugar. Memories of Sunday dinners when this house felt like a home instead of a cold storage facility. I found Thaddeus in what used to be my study, sorting through financial documents with the efficiency of an accountant preparing for an audit. Bank statements, insurance papers, my will, all spread across the desk like a treasure map leading to my demise. "What are you doing with my papers?" He looked up with that patient expression people use when addressing small children or the mentally impaired. "Just organizing your affairs, Dad. Making sure everything's in order in case something happens." In case something happens? Not if. When. As if my death was an inevitable event they were preparing for rather than a distant possibility they hoped to prevent. I'm 72, not 92. And I just passed every cognitive test the rehabilitation center gave me. Of course you did. But his tone suggested he believed otherwise. It's just that managing finances can be overwhelming for someone recovering from a stroke. Morgana and I thought we could help shoulder some of the burden. Burden? There was that word again, following me like a shadow through every conversation. I'd become a burden in my own home, an inconvenience to be managed rather than a father to be cared for. That night, I lay in my basement bed listening to footsteps overhead, normal household sounds that somehow felt threatening now. The murmur of conversation, the occasional laugh, the comfortable rhythm of people who belonged somewhere I no longer did. Through the small basement window, I could see Mrs. Chen's house next door, her kitchen light warm and welcoming. She'd waved when the ambulance took me away 3 weeks ago. Asked Thaddeus to keep her updated on my condition. Had he? Or had he let the neighbors think I'd simply disappeared? Another elderly person who'd quietly faded away. The medication schedule taped to my nightstand reminded me of my new reality. Insulin injections twice daily, blood pressure pills, blood thinners to prevent another stroke. All of it dependent on Thaddeus remembering to fill my prescriptions, on his willingness to drive me to medical appointments, on his basic human decency. As I drifted toward sleep, one thought kept circling in my mind. What had happened to the little boy who used to climb into my lap while I worked on engines, who'd hand me tools and ask 1,000 questions about how things worked? When had that curious, loving child transformed into this cold stranger who saw his father as nothing more than an obstacle to overcome? Morning brought a new set of rules I hadn't agreed to. When I climbed the stairs for breakfast, I found the kitchen door locked. Not broken, not stuck. Locked with a deadbolt that definitely hadn't been there before my hospital stay. "Thaddeus?" I called, rattling the handle. "The door's locked." His voice came from somewhere beyond the kitchen, casual and unhurried. "We installed a security system while you were away, Dad. For everyone's safety." Safety from what? We lived in Millbrook Heights, a neighborhood where the biggest crime was occasionally forgetting to bring in garbage cans. I'd never locked my doors during the day in 30 years of living here. "How do I get breakfast?" "Morgana will bring you something down. We thought it would be easier if you stayed in the basement for now. Less risk of falls on the stairs. Less risk. Or less visibility." I pressed my ear to the door, listening to the sounds of normal morning life being conducted without me. Coffee brewing, news murmuring from the television, the comfortable domesticity of people who had claimed my territory. Morgana appeared an hour later with a tray. Instant oatmeal, lukewarm coffee, and my morning medications in a plastic pill organizer like they used at nursing homes. She set it down on my workbench without meeting my eyes. "This is temporary," she said, as if reading my thoughts. "Just until you're stronger." But her definition of stronger seemed to require something I couldn't provide. My complete disappearance from their lives. The pill organizer bothered me most. I'd been managing my own medications for decades, even through the confusion immediately following my stroke. Now, suddenly, I was deemed incompetent to handle 7 simple pills. "I can manage my own medication," I said. "Of course you can. But this way we can make sure you don't accidentally double dose or miss anything important. It's for your own good, for my own good." The phrase that preceded every loss of autonomy, every reduction in dignity. They were protecting me right out of my own life. That afternoon, I tested the door again. Still locked. The deadbolt required a key from both sides, which meant even if I had a medical emergency, I couldn't get out without their permission. I was effectively imprisoned in my own basement. Through my window, I watched Mrs. Chen working in her garden, completely unaware that her neighbor had become a prisoner 20 feet away. The normalcy of her routine, the simple freedom of walking from her house to her garden whenever she pleased, seemed like an impossible luxury. When evening came, Thaddeus finally unlocked the door and descended the stairs, carrying another tray of food and wearing an expression of forced patience. "How are you feeling, Dad?" Like a hostage, I wanted to say. Like a man whose son has decided he's too inconvenient to live freely. Instead, I asked, "When can I go upstairs again?" "When you're stronger. When we're sure you won't hurt yourself. I need to check my bank statements. Make sure my Social Security deposit went through." His smile was quick and cold. "Already taken care of. I'm managing your finances now, remember? You don't need to worry about any of that. You don't need to worry." Translation: you don't need to know. I was being systematically cut off from every aspect of my independent life, isolated from the outside world, made completely dependent on the goodwill of people who clearly saw me as a burden. But the most chilling realization came when I asked about my upcoming doctor's appointment, the one I needed to check my blood sugar levels, adjust my insulin dosage, ensure I was recovering properly from the stroke. "Oh, I canceled that," Thaddeus said casually. "You're doing fine. No need to waste money on unnecessary visits." Unnecessary. My health, my recovery, my very survival had been deemed unnecessary by my son, and as I watched him lock the door behind him, trapping me in my basement prison, I finally understood what I was dealing with. This wasn't concern for my welfare. This was a calculated plan to make me disappear. 3 days into my basement imprisonment, I woke to a familiar and terrifying sensation. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, my vision blurred, and cold sweat covered my entire body. My blood sugar was crashing, hard and fast. Hypoglycemia. I dealt with it for 15 years, always caught it early, always managed it before it became dangerous. But this felt different, worse. The shaking was so violent I could barely grip my glucose meter, and when I finally managed to test my blood, the reading made my heart skip. 47 mg, DL. Dangerously low. My emergency glucose tablets sat on the nightstand, but when I reached for them with trembling hands, the container was empty. Completely empty. I distinctly remembered having at least 10 tablets left before my hospital stay. "Thaddeus," I called, my voice already weak and slurred. "I need help." Silence from upstairs. They were home. I'd heard them moving around just an hour ago, but no response came to my increasingly desperate calls. The symptoms were accelerating now. Confusion crept in at the edges of my consciousness, making it hard to think clearly. My left leg, already weak from the stroke, felt like rubber. I needed fast-acting sugar immediately, or I was going to lose consciousness. And in this locked basement, unconsciousness meant death. I dragged myself to the door, pounding on it with what little strength remained. "Thaddeus, medical emergency. I need glucose." Finally, footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. Not the rapid response of someone hearing a medical emergency, but the measured pace of someone fulfilling an obligation. "What's all the noise about?" Thaddeus asked through the door. "My blood sugars crashed. I need glucose tablets or orange juice. Now." A pause. A long, calculating pause that sent ice through my veins. "Are you sure? You seemed fine at dinner last night." Fine at dinner? I was dying, and he was questioning my self-diagnosis of a condition I'd managed for 15 years? "Open the door, Thaddeus. I need sugar immediately, or I'm going to pass out." Another pause. Then the sound I'd been dreading. His footsteps moving away from the door. "Thaddeus!" I screamed, putting everything I had left into it. "Come back, I'm diabetic, you know this." His voice drifted down from the kitchen, casual and unconcerned. "Maybe some rest will help. Try to sleep it off. Sleep it off." As if diabetic shock was a hangover that would resolve with time. The man who'd grown up watching me test my blood sugar, who'd seen me rush to treat low glucose episodes, was telling me to sleep off a potentially fatal medical emergency. That's when the horrible truth crystallized through my confused, oxygen-starved brain. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't ignorance. This was intentional. My glucose tablets hadn't been misplaced. They'd been removed. My doctor's appointments hadn't been forgotten. They'd been canceled. The locked door wasn't for my safety. It was to ensure I couldn't seek help when this moment arrived. Thaddeus was trying to kill me. The realization hit me like physical blow, but it also brought a surge of clarity through the diabetic fog. If I was going to survive, I had to act now, before the hypoglycemia robbed me of consciousness entirely. My workshop, 45 years of accumulated supplies and emergency preparations. Somewhere in this basement, I had to have something that could save my life. I crawled toward my workbench, vision tunneling, hands shaking so violently I could barely grip anything. Old coffee cans filled with nuts and bolts, a half-empty bottle of motor oil. And then, like a miracle, I found it. A packet of sugar I'd taken from a restaurant months ago, forgotten in the bottom of my tool drawer. The paper packet felt like salvation in my trembling hands. I tore it open with my teeth and poured the granulated sugar directly onto my tongue, forcing myself to swallow despite the nausea. It wasn't much, maybe 2 teaspoons, but it was something, a temporary reprieve that might keep me conscious long enough to find real help. As the sugar began to work, bringing my blood glucose up from the danger zone, one thought burned through my mind with crystal clarity. My son had just tried to murder me, and if I didn't find a way to escape this basement prison, he was going to succeed. The sugar packet bought me maybe an hour of consciousness, but my blood glucose was still dangerously unstable. I needed real medical attention, proper glucose monitoring, and a safe place to recover. What I got instead was Thaddeus returning to check on his handiwork. The door unlocked with its familiar click, and he descended the stairs wearing an expression of mild concern that would have fooled anyone who hadn't just experienced attempted murder. "How are you feeling, Dad?" I stared at him from my position on the floor, still weak but alert enough to see him clearly for the first time. This wasn't my son. This was a stranger wearing Thaddeus's face, a predator who'd been pretending to be family while planning my death. "You removed my glucose tablets," I said quietly. "What are you talking about?" His performance was flawless. Confusion, worry, just the right amount of concern for a confused elderly father. "You probably just forgot where you put them." I tested my blood sugar. It was 47. That's coma territory, and you know it. He crouched beside me with that patient expression again, the one reserved for small children and the mentally impaired. "Dad, you've been confused since the stroke. Sometimes diabetics think their sugar is low when it's actually fine. Sometimes diabetics. As if I hadn't been managing this condition longer than he'd been alive. As if the glucose meter showing a potentially fatal reading was just a figment of my imagination. "Call an ambulance," I said. "Let the paramedics check my levels." "There's no need for that. You're obviously feeling better now." Better. I was barely conscious, my hands still shaking, my vision still blurred, and he thought I was better. Or more accurately, he thought I was still alive when I should have been dead by now. That's when he noticed the torn sugar packet beside me. His eyes went cold. Calculation replacing the fake concern. "Where did you get that?" "Does it matter?" "It matters because you're supposed to be managing your diet carefully. Random sugar intake could throw off your insulin balance." Random sugar intake. He was lecturing me about blood sugar management while withholding the very supplies that could save my life. The audacity was breathtaking. I struggled to sit up, my back against the workbench. "How long have you been planning this?" "Planning what?" But his voice had changed. Sharper. The mask was slipping. "My death. How long have you been sabotaging my medication? Removing my emergency supplies? Waiting for me to have a crisis you could ignore?" For a moment, his professional facade cracked completely. I saw rage, resentment, and something else. Relief. As if he was tired of pretending to care about his inconvenient father. "You want to know the truth?" He stood up, towering over me with newfound confidence. "I've been planning this since your first stroke. Do you know what it's like watching you cling to life while Morgana and I put our entire future on hold?" There it was, the admission I dreaded but needed to hear. "We're 43 years old, Dad. We should be traveling, buying our own house, starting fresh somewhere new. Instead, we're stuck here playing nursemaid to a man who should have had the decency to die months ago." The words hit me like physical blows. My son, my only child, the boy I'd raised alone after Vivienne died, wanted me dead so he could collect my life insurance and start over without the burden of an aging parent. "The insurance policy," I whispered. His smile was cold and victorious. $400,000, plus whatever we get for selling this house. Enough to finally live the life we deserve instead of being trapped by your medical bills and endless needs. "I'm your father. You're an obstacle. And obstacles have a way of resolving themselves if you're patient enough." He moved toward the stairs, then paused. "The next time your blood sugar crashes, There won't be any convenient sugar packets lying around, and I certainly won't be rushing to help a confused old man who can't remember whether he took his medication properly. Thaddeus, please. No, Dad. Please, nothing. You've had your time, you've lived your life. Now it's my turn. The door slammed shut behind him. The lock clicked with awful finality, and I was alone in my basement prison, fully understanding now that my son wasn't just neglecting me. He was systematically murdering me, one medical crisis at a time. But he'd made one critical mistake. He'd revealed his plan while I was still alive, still conscious, still capable of fighting back. And if Thaddeus thought I'd spent 45 years fixing broken things just to give up when my own life needed repair, he'd seriously underestimated his father. The next morning brought new rules to my captivity. When Morgana delivered my breakfast tray, I noticed immediately that my insulin was missing from the medication organizer. "Where's my insulin?" I asked. "Thaddeus thought you might be taking too much. He's going to manage your injections personally from now on." Managing my injections personally, which meant controlling exactly when I received life-sustaining medication, and more importantly, when I didn't. "I need insulin with meals. It's not optional. He'll be down later to give you your shot. Don't worry." Don't worry. Easy advice from someone whose life didn't depend on precise medication timing. Without insulin, my blood sugar would climb steadily until I fell into diabetic ketoacidosis. Another way to die that could look like natural causes to anyone not paying close attention. Hours passed. No Thaddeus. No insulin. My glucose meter showed my levels creeping higher. 180, 200, 240. Still not immediately dangerous, but heading in a direction that would become fatal if left unchecked. When he finally appeared that evening, I was already feeling the effects of prolonged high blood sugar, fatigue, excessive thirst, blurred vision, all symptoms he would have recognized if he cared about my survival. "Time for your insulin, Dad," but instead of the familiar pen injector, he held a syringe filled with clear liquid. The dosage marking was covered by his thumb, making it impossible to see how much he was preparing to inject. "That's not my usual pen. The pharmacy was out of your brand. This is the same medication, just in a different delivery system." I'd been diabetic for 15 years. I knew every brand of insulin on the market, and I'd never seen packaging like what he was holding. But more concerning was the amount. Even with his thumb blocking the measurement, I could see this was far more than my usual dose. "How many units is that?" "The right amount. Trust me." Trust. The word was obscene, coming from someone who'd been systematically poisoning me through medical neglect. "I want to see the dosage." "Dad, you're not a doctor. Let me handle this." He moved toward me with the syringe, and every instinct I'd developed over 7 decades screamed danger. This wasn't medication. This was a murder weapon disguised as medical care. I rolled away from him, putting the workbench between us. "Stay away from me. Don't be difficult. You need this insulin. Not from you. Not anymore." His mask of patience finally shattered completely. "Fine. You want to do this the hard way?" He set the syringe on my workbench and walked to the door. I heard him speaking to Morgana in the kitchen above, their voices low but urgent. When he returned, he was carrying zip ties and wore the expression of a man who'd run out of subtle options. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice deadly calm. "You're going to take your insulin like a good patient, or I'm going to restrain you and give it to you anyway. Your choice. That's not insulin. That's enough to kill me. Prove it." He held up the syringe, letting me see the dosage for the first time. 50 units. 5 times my normal dose. Enough to send my blood sugar crashing so low I'd be dead within an hour. "You're insane. I'm practical. Do you know what it costs to keep a diabetic stroke patient alive? Medical bills, prescription costs, constant monitoring. You're bleeding us dry. And for what? So you can live another miserable year in this basement?" He advanced on me with the zip ties, and I realized my fighting days as a young mechanic were about to be tested by my son's determination to commit patricide. "Morgana!" I shouted toward the ceiling. "Help me! He's trying to kill me!" Laughter drifted down from above. Actual laughter. As if my pleas for help were entertaining rather than desperate. "She knows," Thaddeus said casually. "She's been planning this with me. Did you really think we'd spend our best years taking care of an invalid without getting something in return? We, both of them, I wasn't just being murdered by my son. I was being murdered by my entire family. The zip ties cut into my wrists as he secured me to the workbench chair. I was trapped, helpless, watching my own son prepare to inject me with a lethal dose of medication while his wife listened to my murder from upstairs. "Any last words?" he asked, raising the syringe like a ceremonial dagger. "Yeah," I said, meeting his eyes with every ounce of defiance I had left. "You're not as smart as you think you are." He laughed, but there was something uncertain in it. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you're about to find out what happens when you underestimate a man who spent 72 years learning how to survive." The syringe was inches from my arm when I made my move. 45 years of working with my hands had left me with knowledge. Thaddeus had never bothered to learn. Every workbench has emergency tools, and zip ties could be cut if you knew where to look. The razor blade I'd palmed while he was tying me up sliced through the plastic restraints in one quick motion. I rolled backward off the chair just as the needle pierced empty air where my arm had been. Thaddeus stumbled forward, off balance, and I did something I'd never imagined doing to my own child. I fought back. My left hand might be weak from the stroke, but my right hand still carried decades of mechanical work. I grabbed the syringe and twisted it away from him, the deadly dose of insulin spraying harmlessly across the concrete floor. "You old fool!" He lunged at me, 43 years old against my 72, but rage and desperation made me stronger than I'd felt in months. We crashed into my workbench, tools scattering everywhere. Above us, I could hear Morgana's footsteps, and I knew I had maybe minutes before she joined the fight. "Help!" I shouted toward my basement window, hoping Mrs. Chen might be in her garden. "Mrs. Chen, call police." Thaddeus wrapped his hands around my throat, cutting off my voice and my air supply. "Should have just taken the insulin, Dad. Would have been peaceful." But he'd forgotten something crucial about old mechanics. We know how to use tools as weapons. My fingers found a heavy wrench, and I brought it down hard on his forearm. He screamed and released me, stumbling backward while clutching his injured arm. I crawled toward the window, my left leg dragging but functional enough to get me across the room. Through the glass, I could see Mrs. Chen's kitchen light, could hear the faint sound of her television. If I could just get her attention. The window was painted shut, unopened for years. I grabbed a hammer from the scattered tools and swung it hard against the glass. The sound of breaking window was like a gunshot in the confined space. "Mrs. Chen," I screamed through the broken opening. "Call 911. I'm being attacked." Above me, Morgana's voice carried a note of panic. "Thaddeus, the neighbors will hear." But Mrs. Chen was already at her back door, her face alarmed as she spotted me through the broken window. 78 years old, but sharp as a razor. She didn't hesitate. "Cornelius? What's happening? My son is trying to kill me. Call police." Behind me, Thaddeus was getting to his feet, his face twisted with fury and calculation. He could hear Mrs. Chen's voice too, knew that his plan was unraveling in real time. "You've ruined everything," he snarled. "Good," I gasped, blood running down my arm from the broken glass. "Maybe now you'll understand what ruin actually feels like." Mrs. Chen had disappeared from view, hopefully to call for help. But Thaddeus wasn't finished. He grabbed another syringe from his pocket, this one pre-filled and ready. "If you won't die quietly, I'll make sure you die loudly." He came at me with the desperate fury of a man whose carefully laid plans were crumbling. But this time, I was ready. This time, I had something he'd never expected me to fight for. The chance to see justice done. The hammer was still in my hand, and 45 years of swinging tools with precision hadn't abandoned me yet. When he lunged with the syringe, I met him with 60 pounds of forged steel delivered with the accuracy of a master craftsman. He went down hard, the second syringe skittering across the floor to join the wreckage of his murder plot. Above us, I could hear Morgana frantically packing, probably preparing to run before the police arrived. Through the broken window, the beautiful sound of sirens was growing louder. Help was coming, justice was coming, and my son was about to learn that some old mechanics don't go quietly into the night. The sirens grew louder, and through my broken window I could see red and blue lights painting the neighborhood in urgent colors. Mrs. Chen stood in her backyard, waving the police toward my basement window with the determination of a woman who'd lived through enough to recognize a real emergency. "Down here," I called through the broken glass. In the basement, Thaddeus was conscious but dazed. holding his head where the hammer had connected. Above us, Morgana's frantic packing had turned into full-scale flight. I could hear drawers slamming, suitcases being dragged across the floor. "Officers!" Mrs. Chen's voice carried clearly through the broken window. "The elderly man lives in the basement. I think his son was trying to hurt him." Heavy footsteps on my front porch, then pounding on the main house door. When no one answered immediately, I heard the authoritative voice of law enforcement, accustomed to dealing with domestic violence. "Police, open the door now." The basement door that had imprisoned me for days suddenly flew open, and Morgana appeared at the top of the stairs. But instead of the concerned daughter-in-law act, she was clearly preparing to run. "Ma'am, step aside," came a voice from behind her. "We need access to the basement." 2 officers descended the stairs, taking in the scene with practiced eyes. Broken window, scattered medical supplies, an injured elderly man, and a younger man sitting dazed among the wreckage of what was clearly a violent struggle. "I'm Officer Martinez," the first responder said, kneeling beside me. "Are you injured, sir?" "My son tried to inject me with a lethal dose of insulin," I said, my voice steady despite everything I'd been through. "There's evidence scattered on the floor." Officer Martinez's partner, a woman with sergeant stripes, was already photographing the scene. The broken syringes, the medication bottles, the zip ties that had been used to restrain me, all of it painted a clear picture of attempted murder. "Sir, we need paramedics down here," Martinez called into his radio. "Elderly male, possible assault, diabetic emergency." Thaddeus was starting to regain his composure, and I watched him slip back into his professional mask. "Officers, my father is confused. He's been having episodes since his stroke, and I was just trying to give him his prescribed medication when he became violent." The performance was good. Concerned son dealing with an elderly parent's declining mental state. If the officers hadn't seen the evidence, they might have believed him. But Sergeant Hayes held up one of the broken syringes, squinting at the measurement markings. 50 units of insulin for a diabetic his size? That's not prescription dosage. That's attempted murder. There must be some mistake. "The mistake," I said quietly, "was thinking I'd die quietly while you collected my insurance money." Mrs. Chen appeared at the broken window, her face flushed from running between houses. "Officers," I heard him screaming for help. "I've known Cornelius for 20 years, and I've never seen him violent or confused. That boy has been keeping him locked in this basement for days." Days. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Sergeant Hayes looked at Thaddeus with the expression of someone who'd seen enough domestic abuse to recognize the patterns. "Son, you're under arrest for attempted murder, elder abuse, and false imprisonment." The handcuffs clicked around Thaddeus's wrists with satisfying finality. As they led him toward the stairs, he looked back at me with pure hatred. "This isn't over," he hissed. "Yes, it is," I replied. "It's been over since the moment you decided your father's life was worth less than your convenience." Upstairs, they found Morgana attempting to escape through the back door with 2 suitcases and my medical records. Her arrest was quieter but no less satisfying. As the paramedics checked my blood sugar and treated my cuts from the broken window, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Safety. Not just physical safety, but the deeper security that comes from knowing the truth has been heard and believed. "Mr. Blackwood," Sergeant Hayes said, settling into a chair beside my stretcher. "We're going to need a full statement. But first, is there anyone you'd like us to call? Family? Friends?" I looked around my basement workshop, at the broken glass and scattered tools, at the evidence of my son's betrayal. Then I looked through the window at Mrs. Chen, who was still standing guard in her garden, making sure I was safe. "Mrs. Chen is my family now," I said. "The only family that matters." The emergency room at Millbrook General buzzed with the controlled chaos of a Saturday night, but in my private room, everything felt surreal and quiet. Dr. Patricia Wells, the attending physician, had stabilized my blood sugar and treated my lacerations, but more importantly, she documented every aspect of the medical abuse I'd suffered. "Mr. Blackwood, your insulin levels were dangerously erratic," she said, reviewing my charts. "Someone has been deliberately manipulating your medication. Combined with the evidence of physical restraint and the attempted overdose, we have a clear case of attempted murder through medical abuse." Medical abuse. Finally, Someone in authority was calling it what it was. Detective Frank Morrison arrived as Dr. Wells was finishing her examination. Tall, gray-haired, with the weary eyes of someone who'd seen too much family violence. He pulled up a chair and opened his notebook. Mr. Blackwood, I've been investigating elder abuse cases for 15 years. What your son did to you ranks among the most calculated attempts at murder I've encountered. Will he actually face consequences? Oh, he'll face consequences. Morrison's smile was grim but satisfied. Attempted murder in the first degree, elder abuse, false imprisonment, conspiracy to commit fraud. Your daughter-in-law is facing the same charges. We found detailed financial planning documents in their bedroom, including calculations of your life insurance payout and plans for selling your house. They'd been planning my death like a business transaction, complete with spreadsheets and timelines. The betrayal was so complete, so coldly calculated, that I almost felt impressed by their thoroughness. There's something else, Morrison continued. We found your medical records. Your son had been calling your doctors, canceling appointments, claiming you were too confused to need regular care. He also contacted your insurance company twice, asking about the exact requirements for death benefit payouts. Every detail painted the same picture. A man so eager for his inheritance that he'd been actively working to ensure it came as quickly as possible. A knock on my hospital room door interrupted our conversation. Through the glass, I could see Thaddeus in handcuffs, flanked by 2 officers. For a moment I thought they were bringing him to see me. Then I realized he'd asked to come. He's requesting to speak with you, Morrison explained. You have every right to refuse. I looked at my son through the glass, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Not the boy I'd raised, not the man I'd hoped he'd become, but the person he actually was, someone capable of patricide for financial gain. Let him in, I want to hear what he has to say. They brought him in still handcuffed, his professional demeanor completely shattered. Gone was the smooth, confident man who'd been managing my imprisonment. In his place stood someone who looked smaller, older, defeated. Dad? His voice cracked on the single word. Thaddeus. I never meant for it to go this far. We were so desperate. The financial pressure, watching you get sicker, knowing we were trapped. Trapped. I kept my voice level, clinical. You felt trapped living rent-free in my house while I recovered from a stroke. You don't understand what it's like, being middle-aged and dependent on your parents' charity. Charity? The word tasted bitter. I called it love. I called it family. I called it what any parent does for their child. He looked away, unable to meet my eyes. We made mistakes. You made choices. You chose to remove my glucose tablets. You chose to cancel my medical appointments. You chose to lock me in the basement and inject me with a lethal dose of insulin. Those weren't mistakes, Thaddeus. That was attempted murder. I'm your son. No. The clarity of that statement surprised even me. My son died the moment you decided my life was worth less than your comfort. I don't know who you are, but you're not my son. For the first time since his arrest, I saw genuine emotion in his face. Not remorse, not regret, but loss. The dawning understanding that he'd destroyed something irreplaceable in pursuit of something worthless. Dad, please, if you could just tell them it was a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want me to help you escape justice for trying to kill me? I'm all the family you have left. You stopped being my family the moment you chose money over my life. And frankly, I'd rather have no family than family that wants me dead. Detective Morrison stepped forward. That's enough. Mr. Blackwood needs rest. As they led Thaddeus away, he looked back one final time. You'll regret this when you're all alone. No, I said quietly. I'll regret the 37 years I spent believing you were someone you never were. But stopping you from killing me? That's the best decision I've made in decades. The door closed behind them, and I was alone with the profound silence that follows the end of everything you thought you knew about your life. But it wasn't empty silence. It was the silence of possibility, of freedom, of a future I'd get to choose for myself. The trial of Thaddeus and Morgana Blackwood became a sensation in Millbrook Heights, the kind of case that made national news and left neighbors shaking their heads in disbelief. How could a son try to murder his father for insurance money? How could a family turn so completely against its most vulnerable member? I testified for 3 hours, my voice steady as I recounted every detail of their systematic abuse. The locked doors, the canceled medical appointments, the removed glucose tablets, the attempted insulin overdose. By the time I finished, several jurors were wiping their eyes. Thaddeus's lawyer tried to paint me as a confused elderly man whose medical conditions had affected his judgment, but the evidence was overwhelming. Recorded confessions, documented medical manipulation, financial planning documents outlining their scheme, and Mrs. Chen's eyewitness testimony of my desperate calls for help. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. Thaddeus received 15 years for attempted murder and elder abuse. Morgana got 10 years as an accessory. Both were ordered to pay restitution for my medical expenses and emotional trauma, though I doubted I'd ever see that money. More importantly, the case led to new legislation strengthening protections for elderly family members and requiring multiple medical opinions before life-sustaining treatments could be discontinued. 6 months after the trial, I stood in the living room of my new apartment at Sunrise Assisted Living, watching Mrs. Chen hang curtains with the precision of someone who'd been decorating homes for 78 years. "These will look perfect when they catch the morning light," she said, stepping back to admire her work. Mrs. Chen had become more than a neighbor. She'd become the family I'd always deserved. When I decided to sell the house and move to assisted living, she'd made the same choice. "At our age, we shouldn't be alone," she'd said simply. The apartment was bright, modern, and safe. No locked doors, no medication hidden from me, no one calculating my life insurance value. Just independence, dignity, and the kind of security that comes from choosing your own family. "Mr. Blackwood?" A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. It was Jennifer, one of the assisted living staff members, holding an envelope. "This came for you today. Legal mail." The return address made my stomach tighten. Millbrook County Correctional Facility. Thaddeus was writing from prison. Mrs. Chen looked at the envelope with the wariness of someone who'd lived through enough drama. "You don't have to open that." "No, I do. I need to see what he has to say." The letter was short, written in Thaddeus's careful handwriting. "Dad, I've had time to think about what I did. The counselor here says I need to make amends, to take responsibility for my actions. I know saying sorry doesn't fix anything, but I want you to know I regret what happened. I was desperate and stupid and greedy, and I let those feelings turn me into someone I don't recognize. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that somewhere inside the person who tried to hurt you, there's still a part of the boy who loved his father. I hope you're safe and happy. I hope you have people around you who treat you the way I should have. Your son, Thaddeus." I read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in my desk drawer. Not because I forgave him, but because it represented something important, the acknowledgement of truth. "What did he say?" Mrs. Chen asked. "That he's sorry. That he was wrong. That he hopes I'm happy." "Are you happy?" I looked around my apartment, at the medical alert system that connected me to help whenever I needed it, at the community of friends I'd made, at the calendar full of activities I'd chosen for myself. Most importantly, I looked at Mrs. Chen, who'd risked her own safety to save my life and then chosen to share her remaining years with me. "Yes," I said, and meant it completely. For the first time in years, I'm actually happy. 1 year after the trial, I received an unexpected visitor at Sunrise Assisted Living. Detective Morrison appeared in our community room during afternoon coffee, looking more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. "Mr. Blackwood, I hope you don't mind the interruption. I have some news I thought you'd want to hear." Mrs. Chen and I were in the middle of a chess game, but she graciously moved to give us privacy while remaining close enough to eavesdrop, which I appreciated. "Your case inspired something significant," Morrison said, settling into Mrs. Chen's vacated chair. "The Elder Protection Act passed last month. Mandatory medical advocacy, financial oversight for at-risk seniors, and criminal penalties for family members who exploit vulnerable adults. Your story literally changed the law." Changed the law. My nightmare had become someone else's protection. "There's more. The district attorney's office has asked if you'd be willing to speak at a conference on elder abuse. Share your story with law enforcement and social workers nationwide." The idea of standing before a room full of strangers and recounting the worst betrayal of my life should have terrified me. Instead, I felt energized. "When and where?" "Chicago next month. All expenses paid, and Mrs. Chen is invited too if she'd like to come." Mrs. Chen looked up from her strategic retreat near the coffee machine. Did someone mention a trip to Chicago? I haven't been there in 20 years. 3 weeks later, we stood before an auditorium full of police officers, social workers, attorneys, and medical professionals. I'd prepared notes, but when I looked out at their faces, I set the papers aside and spoke from my heart. A year ago, I thought family meant blood relation. I thought love meant accepting whatever treatment your relatives decided you deserved. I thought growing old meant becoming powerless. The room was completely silent. 500 people hanging on every word. I was wrong about all of it. Family means people who protect you, not people who exploit you. Love means respect, dignity, and care for your well-being. And growing old doesn't mean giving up your right to live safely. I told them about the locked doors, the hidden medications, the calculated cruelty disguised as care. But I also told them about Mrs. Chen's courage, about the officers who believed me, about the medical professionals who recognized abuse when they saw it. The most important thing I learned is this: it's never too late to demand better. It's never too late to fight for justice. And it's never too late to find people who will treat you the way every human being deserves to be treated. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Afterward, we were approached by dozens of people sharing their own stories, their own victories, their own ongoing struggles with elder abuse. Social workers thanked me for giving them language to describe what they saw in the field. Police officers asked for tips on recognizing medical manipulation. Adult children of aging parents promised to examine their own attitudes and behaviors. But the conversation that affected me most came from a woman in her 50s who pulled me aside during the reception. My father is living with us, and I've been getting frustrated with his needs, his medical appointments, his confusion sometimes. Listening to your story made me realize I was starting down the same path your son took. Thank you for helping me see it before I went too far. That night, in our hotel room overlooking Lake Michigan, Mrs. Chen and I sat by the window watching the city lights reflect on the water. You did something important today, she said. We did something important. None of this would have happened without you. She smiled, the expression of someone who'd lived long enough to know the difference between false modesty and genuine gratitude. I just called the police. You did the hard part. The hard part was trusting that someone would believe me. Someone would help. You made that possible. 6 months later, we were featured in a documentary about elder abuse. Our story part of a larger examination of how society treats its aging population. The filmmaker was respectful, focusing on the systemic issues rather than sensationalizing the personal drama. When the documentary aired, we hosted a viewing party in the Sunrise Community Room. 37 residents gathered to watch my story unfold on screen, offering commentary, support, and the occasional gasp of outrage at Thaddeus's behavior. You know what I love about this place? Said Harold, the veteran who'd become our poker group's unofficial philosopher. Nobody here sees aging as shameful. We all know growing old is a privilege denied to many. That simple statement captured something profound. In this community, wrinkles were earned, medical needs were normal, and slower movements were accepted without judgment. No one here saw my stroke recovery as a burden or my diabetes as an inconvenience. The documentary led to speaking opportunities across the country. Mrs. Chen and I traveled to conferences, universities, and community centers, sharing our story and advocating for stronger elder protection laws. Each speech refined my message. Elder abuse thrives in silence and isolation. It ends when we speak up, stand up, and refuse to accept maltreatment disguised as family dynamics. But the most meaningful moment came 2 years after the trial, when I received a letter from a woman in Oregon. Mr. Blackwood, I saw your documentary and recognized my own situation. My daughter was controlling my medications and finances, keeping me isolated from friends. Inspired by your courage, I called the police. She's now facing charges, and I'm safe in a wonderful assisted living community. Your story literally saved my life. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to fight back. Ruth Henderson, age 81. Letters like Ruth's arrived weekly. Stories of seniors finding courage to report abuse, families recognizing their own destructive patterns, communities implementing better protection systems. My betrayal by Thaddeus had become a catalyst for protecting countless other vulnerable adults. On my 75th birthday, the Sunrise community threw a party that filled the entire dining room. Mrs. Chen had organized everything, from my favorite chocolate cake to a slideshow of our travels and adventures. As I looked around the room at these people who'd chosen to celebrate my life rather than calculate its value, I felt a completeness I'd never experienced even in my best days with blood family. "Speech," called Harold from across the room. I stood slowly, my left leg still weak but steady enough to support me, and raised my coffee cup. 3 years ago, I thought my life was ending. I thought family betrayal meant the end of love, the end of trust, the end of hope. Instead, it led me to the best years I've ever had. I looked at Mrs. Chen, whose decision to call for help had saved more than just my life. I learned that family isn't about shared DNA. It's about shared values. It's about people who celebrate your survival rather than calculate your worth. It's about growing old with dignity, surrounded by people who see your years as achievements rather than failures. The room erupted in applause, and I sat back down feeling lighter than I had in decades. That night, as I prepared for bed in my safe, comfortable apartment, I thought about Thaddeus in his prison cell. Did he understand yet what he'd lost? Did he realize that his pursuit of my money had cost him something infinitely more valuable? I hoped so, not because I forgave him, but because understanding was the first step toward ensuring he never hurt anyone else the same way. The next morning brought news that filled me with pride. The Elder Protection Act had been adopted in 12 additional states, and there was momentum for federal legislation. The documentary had been nominated for an Emmy, and I'd received an invitation to speak at the United Nations International Day of Older Persons. "Look at you, becoming a celebrity," Mrs. Chen teased over breakfast. "Look at us," I corrected. None of this happens without the woman who had the courage to call for help. That afternoon, I sat in my favorite spot by the window, watching children play in the courtyard below. Their laughter carried on the autumn breeze, a sound full of hope and possibility. My phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer, the assisted living director. "Mr. Blackwood, we've received 3 new inquiries from families who saw your story and want their elderly relatives to experience the kind of care and dignity you found here. Your advocacy is changing lives." I smiled, remembering the scared, isolated man I'd been 3 years ago, locked in a basement by people who should have protected me. That man could never have imagined becoming an advocate for vulnerable seniors, traveling the country, changing laws, saving lives. But that's the thing about surviving betrayal. It can destroy you, or it can reveal strength you never knew you had. Through my window, I could see Mrs. Chen in the garden, tending to the flowers we'd planted together last spring. At 81, she moved with the careful precision of someone who understood that every day was a gift, every moment of independence a victory. My phone rang. Detective Morrison's voice was warm with satisfaction. "Cornelius, I thought you'd want to know. Thaddeus was denied parole. The board cited your victim impact statement and the ongoing importance of your advocacy work. He'll serve his full sentence." "Good," I said, and meant it. Some consequences needed to be seen through to completion. There's something else. We've had 5 elder abuse cases this month where family members cited your story as inspiration to report. Your courage is creating a ripple effect. After we hung up, I sat in the peaceful silence of my apartment, surrounded by photos of Mrs. Chen and me at various speaking engagements, letters from people whose lives had been changed by our story, awards and recognitions that represented not personal achievement but systemic change. The boy I'd raised might have chosen money over love, but I'd chosen justice over family loyalty, and that choice had led me to something better than blood relations. It had led me to people who'd chosen to love me just as I was, and a purpose that extended far beyond my own survival. That evening, as Mrs. Chen and I shared dinner with our chosen family of fellow residents, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a life well lived, not because it had been easy or perfect, but because when faced with ultimate betrayal, I'd chosen to fight rather than surrender. At 75, I was healthier, happier, and more purpose-driven than I'd been in decades. I had work that mattered, relationships built on mutual respect, and the security that comes from knowing I'd never again accept maltreatment disguised as love. The night was clear, and through my bedroom window, I could see stars scattered across the darkness like promises of hope. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to speak truth, to protect the vulnerable, to ensure that what happened to me would never happen to someone else who lacked the strength or resources to fight back. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, safe, valued, and surrounded by people who understood that growing old wasn't about becoming invisible. It was about becoming wise enough to demand the respect we'd always deserved. If you like this story, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments about what family really means to you. And remember, it's never too late to choose dignity over dependency, justice over silence, and real love over blood relation.